Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Everybody, welcome to episode 245 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. I'm glad to have you with us. Welcome. Hope everyone is doing well. As this episode is coming out, we're in the middle of April, and there's a lot happening this week. Taxes were due, and the Florida bar results are coming out. So there's a lot happening, and that's just in our world. So hope things are going well for you. If you're waiting for your results in Florida or any other jurisdiction from the February 2019 exams, good luck to you. We will be filling everybody in on results probably in our next episode of the podcast, at least the early results as we begin to see them. Now, I do want to say today's episode is one that I'm really excited about. It's called, Why Is It So Hard to Get Started? We're going to look at some things that really get in the way, that create procrastination, and some ways to break through that. I think you're going to find them really helpful. So if you've been thinking about starting your studies for July 2019 or beyond, and you're having a hard time getting started, stick with us. We're going to give you some tools and techniques to use. But we're going to procrastinate for a minute. Before we get there, I just want to handle some housekeeping and update you on some things happening with bar results in this early part of April. First, the housekeeping. I want to let you know that our episode can be watched on video by going to celebrationbarreview.com/245. That's the episode number. And most of our episodes for the last year or so are on video, so you can just use the episode number and check it out that way. You can also listen to our episodes on Apple iTunes Radio, on iHeartRadio, and on Spotify, as well as a lot of other places where podcasts are syndicated. And if none of those methods work, you can always go back into our archives. You can find those on our website. There's a tab at the top that says podcast. Just click there. We go all the way back to episode number 1, along with the show notes. So make sure you check all that out. I also want to let you know that this episode is being brought to you, as always, by our webinar, our free webinar. It's called Do Something Different. Make the next bar exam your last bar exam. This is a 90-minute look at the 4 steps that successful bar takers follow in order to pass their exam. And I'm really excited because the things that we've been doing in this webinar over the past few years have just been so effective. And now we're seeing people that have gone through that webinar who are now passing their bar exams, and I'm getting the opportunity to interview and talk with them. So I hope you'll check out this webinar. It's really wonderful, and it's completely free. The time of the webinar is Thursday night at 7 p.m. local time. And in order to attend, you do have to register so that we know the right time to start for you. You can do that by clicking on the button here on the show notes page on either the video or audio podcast, or by going to this website, celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. So again, it's celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. You can register, and then we'll see you Thursday night, 7 p.m. It's a terrific opportunity to find out what it is you have to do in order to make the next bar exam your last bar exam. And hey, we even gave you the hint. You got to do something different. So there you go. Hope you'll join us for that. Now, I do want to talk for just a moment about where we are in the bar exam results season, because we've just begun that. In the first week of April, we had at least 3 states releasing results. 2 of them are fairly large states. North Carolina and Illinois both released results. Wisconsin released their results as well. That's a much smaller state, fewer than 100 bar takers there. We can't tell you a whole lot yet about the numbers. Illinois was a non-UBE jurisdiction. This was the last time Illinois was testing in their state-specific format. So they switched to the UBE coming up in July 2019. And North Carolina had just switched to the UBE in their exam. And both of these states have, not as many bar takers, obviously, as Florida or California, but they have a fair number. And from that, one of the things that we can tell you right now is that the multi-state score nationally looks to be at its lowest level in perhaps 20 years or more. It appears from the early numbers that the multi-state, the MBE, that the mean score across the country was quite low. It dropped again even from last year. Now, this is not a great surprise because the February bar exam typically has lower scores than the July exam. The depth of that drop we'll find out more about in the next few days and week. And I'll bring you that information as we begin to get it. But I think it is significant that the number did go down. We know that. The question is, how far down did it go, and what number is it hitting? I'm seeing reports that it may be something equivalent to what we saw in the early 1980s. So that would be a dramatic decline. Now, just because that's happening nationally doesn't mean it's going to happen to you. It certainly doesn't appear to be something that's happening to our students. Our early reports out of a couple of these states have been very good, and I hope to bring you some interviews in the next couple of weeks with some of our successful students in those jurisdictions. Nonetheless, it is an early bellwether. You might say it's the canary in the coal mine that tells us it's going to be a hard exam season. That doesn't surprise me either. Typically, February exams are difficult, and I think we're going to get the first real indication of that with the February results that come out from Florida. So the Florida February results are due to be released on April 15th. That's a Monday, and we will hold our episode recording, at least part of it, to try and give you the early feedback on those results after they come out on the 15th. So that'll be the first big state that we hear about. Then we will hear later in the month probably about New York, New Jersey, Texas. Those are fairly large states, obviously, that have big results to come in. And then we'll hear California and Georgia later in the season. And of course, a lot of other states that are in the uniform bar exam will be releasing throughout the latter half of April and the early part of May. So we'll keep you informed to let you know what we hear about those. But in the 3 states that did release, the results were not good. Low results, less than half passing in some jurisdictions. So I think that, it's something that creates a lot of apprehension and anxiety on the part of bar takers. We recognize that. My goal here is not to make you even more nervous if you're waiting for your results. It's simply to indicate how important it is to get started early and how important it is to get underway productively. And I think that's a pretty good segue into what we wanted to talk about this week. Now, you may recall in the last couple of episodes, I've been talking about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I encourage you to check out episodes 242, 243, 244, 3-part series where we talked about that concept. And I got a lot of feedback on those episodes. And one of the areas of feedback I got was from folks that said, I know that I feel uncomfortable. I know the things I've got to do, but I am having a really hard time getting started. I just don't know how to get underway, even though I know it's just absolutely critical. And so I thought it would make sense today to talk about why it's so hard to get started, and then give you some tools, some ways that I've found that you can overcome that procrastination or that delay or just that sense of dread that you've got that's keeping you from getting underway and getting started. Now, this would be true whether you're taking the July 2019 exam for the first time. Maybe you're a bar repeater. Maybe you've just gotten results in one of these jurisdictions and now you've learned you have to take the exam again. It's certainly true for those that are taking the exam in 2020 and maybe you're thinking, I don't want to start quite yet. But the truth is, the earlier you begin, the better off you'll be. And so we want to encourage you to get an early start. It's why we encourage people to get into our webinar, to go through that training, to start their studies as early as they can. An early start makes a difference. We see a difference in results based on when people begin. So if you're taking the July 2019 exam, it's not too early. In fact, you're starting to get close to the it's almost too late period, and it's really critical that you get started. But even as I say that, I know that for some of you, that just forces down even more the panic button and causes you to be even more anxious and to feel even more like you just can't get started. And that's not our goal here. We want to show you how to do that. So I want to talk today about some reasons why it's difficult for bar takers to get started. And then I want to talk, secondly, about some habits that you can use to overcome delay. We're going to rely a lot on a book I've been talking about recently by James Clear. It's called Atomic Habits. I really encourage you to check it out. And then I'm going to talk about some tools that we offer within our course that I think can be very helpful for dealing with that delay and procrastination. So let's jump into the first of our 3 reasons, first of 3 points about why it's so hard to get started and how to fix it. And the first thing I want to talk about are the reasons why it's hard to get started. And I suppose that for some people it would be obvious. I just don't want to do it. That's okay, I get that. But I think there's some more deep-seated reasons than that. In my experience of working with bar takers, I found that fear is a huge, huge factor. It's not always the kind of fear that presents itself obviously or presents itself externally, but it's there and it's pretty palpable for a lot of people. What is it that we're afraid of? Well, it depends on the individual, but I think in all of us, there's some degree of fear of failure when you do something like taking a high-stakes exam. Bar takers, for the most part, have never failed any exam in their life. That's how they got into a position to be in law school and to sit for the bar exam. So the idea of failing a test is really an overwhelming problem. If you've taken the exam and failed before, that's just exponentially worse. And this fear of compounding failure gets harder and harder and harder. One of the things I see when someone gets their results and they fail the exam is that often they are so discouraged by that result that they literally can't get past that fear of failing again, and they procrastinate and put themselves in an impossible position with respect to the next exam. If you're getting your results now around the February 2019 exam, for example, you need to get started right away for the July exam. And this would be true in every exam season. You don't get much of a luxury of waiting around to grieve the result. You have to get back up and get underway immediately. But that fear of failure can be a huge obstacle. And I think sometimes you just have to name it. You just have to identify it and say, you know, what I'm really afraid of here is failing again. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's important to recognize that it's there. And if you're feeling that, you're not alone. You're not the only person that ever felt that way. You're not an aberration or a freak. It is very, very common. In fact, I'd say fear of failure is probably the most common reason that people hold off and procrastinate. A second fear that I think affects a lot of bar takers is the fear of the unknown. They literally don't know, in a lot of cases, what's coming up. If you're a first-time bar taker, maybe you've been holding off, and you keep hearing the horror stories. You hear people like me talking about results being lower and lower. You hear all of the things that are being said online. You read the snarky blogs, and it just becomes a case of what is coming? What's coming at me? How awful could this thing be? And, you know, we have a tendency in life to take the unknown and make it bigger and more frightening than it really is. Think back to when you first were getting ready to go to law school. You didn't know what was coming. Maybe you'd read some books or seen some movies. Maybe you'd had people tell you about it. I had all of those things happen to me. I had two sisters who'd already been through law school, and that's the worst possible experience in the world because they couldn't resist telling me all the things that were going to happen to me. I didn't want to know. It wasn't helpful to me. I didn't appreciate it. I still don't appreciate it 40 years later. But the point is that the fear of the unknown was way worse than what I actually experienced. If I had just been able to get in and do it, I think, you know, after the first week or 2 weeks or month of law school, I was like, okay, I get it. I see what's going on now. But man, I was a quivering mass of neuroses before I walked in the first day of law school. And maybe that was true for you as well. And I think the same is true when it comes to the bar exam. There's a real fear of the unknown. What is this test? What's it about? What's the right way to prepare? What do I need to do? And there's a lot of competing narratives out there about those things, to be sure. My narrative has been consistent all along, but it's very different than the one you hear from Barbary or Kaplan or Themis or any big box bar review. And so that can be confusing to people. It can be a sense of, well, what am I supposed to do with this? I'll simply say this, that in 30 years of teaching thousands of people to take the bar, I have never found anybody that performed better by thinking that the exam was bigger and more frightening and more overwhelming than it really is. The reality of the exam is that it tests a basic body of skills, and you're capable of practicing and performing those skills if you graduated from law school. And that's the truth. That's the reality. Everything else is just window dressing, and a fair amount of that window dressing is designed to scare people into buying courses. And that's really a sad commentary on my industry, but that's the reality that I've seen. And so if you're afraid of the unknown, let me just tell you that it will be okay. You will survive it. You will get it step by step by step. You know, sometimes people buy a course like ours, they get underway, they buy the course, and then they just sit there. And we contact them. We say, how you doing? Day 1, crickets. Day 2, crickets. Day 3, crickets. Okay, now we got to intervene. Something's going on here. And we say, what is it? Well, I'm afraid I don't know how to get online, or I don't know how to get started, or I don't know how to write an essay, or I don't know how to memorize, or I don't, you know, we're like, you don't need to know all those things. All you got to do is follow the syllabus. Just do one assignment, do one step, take one step at a time. Obviously, the old aphorism about eating an elephant one bite at a time really applies to any big task, and the bar exam is certainly a big task. Don't let what you don't know overwhelm you and keep you away from being successful. That fear of the unknown is real and it's legitimate, but it shouldn't be a reason to not do anything. Recognize that every day that you study, every day you get involved, you learn a little bit more. The unknown becomes the known. And that's a really great feeling when you begin to realize that you do know more than you thought you did. The third fear, the final one that I want to talk about, although there's just so many fears, I could go on and on and on. But the third fear, the one that I hear the most, is a fear of judgment. You know, nobody likes to be judged. Nobody likes to be told that they're less than. Nobody likes to be evaluated. I'm not a big fan when people write back and they comment on my podcasts or my whatever. I mean, my voice, my hair, my background, whatever it might be. You know, I don't like to be judged. I don't know anybody that likes to be judged. And the bar exam is the ultimate judgment in some respects. It's the judgment that lets you go forward or not in your chosen career. And so if you're feeling discomfort about this idea of being judged, you're not alone. I think that for a lot of people, the fear of being judged, of judging whether or not you're intellectually sufficient or you're being judged on your ability to practice law, becomes so overwhelming that they literally don't want to begin. The fear of failure that we talked about before, combined with the fear of judgment, just becomes a 1-2 punch that keeps us locked into our position. You might say, well, why would somebody who's afraid of all those things not want to take care of it? And the answer is that we don't consciously make that decision. We make that decision non-consciously. We tell ourselves that we're okay, but non-consciously, our non-conscious brain is saying, well, I am afraid of the judgment and I am afraid of failure and I don't want to look like a fool. And so it's a lot easier to not do anything. And then I've got a good reason, a good excuse for why I didn't pass the bar. It wasn't because I wasn't smart enough or I wasn't capable enough or talented enough. It's because I didn't have enough time. Now, you'll see this fear pop up in a lot of other ways and a lot of other justifications for failure. My bar review was bad. My law school was bad. My family didn't support me. I didn't have enough time. I didn't have enough money. There was too much going on at work. The list of items are endless, and most of them have some kernel of truth. But the reality is that at its core, it's that fear that keeps us from tackling those things and getting them out of the way. So I think if you're struggling with how to get started, one of the first things you need to do is ask yourself, what am I afraid of? And maybe you want to make a list. What is it that I'm afraid of? Don't have to share it with anybody, but really write it down and be honest. And then look at the list objectively and say, do I really need to be afraid of each of these items? And what's the downside to each one? The other primary reason beyond fear that I see as a cause of why people find it hard to get started is simply the sense of being overwhelmed, the scope of the work. This is one of the bigger tasks that most people are going to take on in their professional career, certainly early on in their career. And this would be more true for a 3L or a 4L in some respects than a practicing attorney, although for many practicing attorneys, it's even worse in the sense that you've got to add this on top of your life and your family and your practice. And so I think for a lot of people, that's a big deal. But the reality here is that the scope of work to study for the bar exam is immense. Most bars in the US take at least 13 or 14 subjects between the multi-state and the state exam. Some have as many as 20 to 25 subjects. That's a huge body of material to acquire at least a passable body of knowledge and understanding in. And it really is overwhelming to a lot of people. Now, I think that the solution for this sense of being overwhelmed because of the amount of information is to get an early start. If you're taking the exam in 2020, as you're listening to this podcast on the day that it's coming out, it's okay to start now. That's a really good idea to start now. Give yourself time to acquire that information. The scope of work is far less overwhelming if you can study it in 5 or 10-hour segments per week for a period of a year. If you've got to study in a 4 to 6 month period, in our course, you're going to need about 20 hours a week, and that's manageable for most people. But when you get less than that 4-month period, you're going to start to see the number of hours go up. And now the scope of work can really be very overwhelming to many people. If you have other responsibilities like a family, like your practice, like your community, like your job, but you have to balance while you're studying, you can get overwhelmed really quickly. And so I want to talk about some habits you can create to help deal with that sense of being overwhelmed, because there are some ways of breaking it down that make it manageable and workable. And that really leads us to our second point, which is what habits can we create that will help us overcome procrastination or delay? Now, as I said, I've drawn a lot of this material from a book I photo-read recently that I really encourage you to check out. It's called Atomic Habits by James Clear, and we'll link to it in the show notes. In this book, Clear talks about a lot of techniques and strategies for creating small habits that he calls stackable, habits that you put in stacks, like Legos, I guess, in order to create new behaviors based on small habits. That's why he calls them atomic. And he's got some real wisdom here, I think, about how to get involved in breaking down this procrastination and delay in any setting. Now, there's a lot that he talks about, but I want to focus on just two ideas right now. The first is this idea of finding a new, basically a new stimulus and a new response. There is something called the stimulus response cycle that Clear talks about, and it's great information, and you should certainly check it out. But for our purposes today, I simply want to create a formula for you, and then we'll try and fill it in. Here's the formula. When situation X, we'll fill that in, situation X arises, I will perform response Y. So again, let me say it. When situation X arises, I will perform response Y. This one statement, if you'll write it down and use it, can help you get started in a remarkably easy way. This is what's called an implementation intention. It's very simply that when a certain stimulus occurs, I'm going to perform a certain response. So when my phone buzzes, I'm going to pull it out of my pocket and look at it, right? Or if I smell chocolate chip cookies, I'm going to go eat one. I think there are different things. If I hear an ambulance siren while I'm driving, I'm going to pull my car over to the side of the road. So there is a situation in which we perform a response. So one of the ways that we think about this is thinking about this idea of what kind of situation could occur and what my response be to it. So how do we get to that situation and response that works for us in studying? Well, we have to go one step further to this idea of finding a certain kind of behavior at a certain time in a particular location. This is the implementation intention, and it builds on this idea of situations and responses. So again, here's the statement that we're going to use and we're going to build on. I will do X behavior at X time in X location. Very simple. I will do this behavior at this time in this location. Now here's how that plays out for study. You could set up an intention that says, I will study torts for 60 minutes in my bedroom. Pretty simple, right? What you're doing is you're saying, here is the behavior. I'm going to study torts. I'm going to do it for 60 minutes, so at a time, or I might say, for 30 minutes or whatever it might be. And I'm going to pick a location in my bedroom, at the office, at the back porch, on my desk, at my desk, whatever it might be. But you set a behavior, a time, and a location. Now, why do you want to do that? Well, interestingly enough, studies have found that when we set a certain time and a certain location, we tend to show up for those things. So perhaps you've had the experience of setting an appointment to come back and have doctor's work done at a certain time, or a dentist appointment at a certain time. Studies show that we're more likely to follow through on those things when we set a specific time and a specific location. If you're having trouble starting your bar study, one of the most effective things you can do is to sit down and say, you know what, I know that in order to pass the bar, I have to get through this number of assignments in the coming month. So I break that down week by week, day by day, and I say, I will study blank at blank time in blank location. By doing that, you're giving yourself the command that makes it possible to start moving progressively from step to step to step. If you have trouble doing that, then I'd go back to step one. What is it that's blocking you? What's the fear? What's the scope of work that seems to be overwhelming you? But my experience has been that when people start to break their studies down this way, it's pretty manageable. So if you put into your schedule that you're going to study the bar exam on Wednesday for 60 minutes in your office, it's more likely to happen than if you just say, I'm going to study for 5 hours this week on the bar exam. And the more specific you can be about your study, probably the better. But here's the caveat. You don't want to say, I'm going to study torts next month on Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m. in my office. Why? Because too much happens in that intervening time. I really like setting up these structure of schedules in about a rolling 7-day period, because I think you can stay pretty current within 7 days. But if you get much beyond that, I think it's hard to be successful. So again, the idea is I will set a behavior at a certain time in a certain location. Very, very powerful technique. Then Clear goes on to talk about something he calls habit stacking. And what he means by this is that you simply say, after current habit, I will add new habit. Now, what does that mean? Let's say that the habit you've created now is that you're going to read torts for 60 minutes in your office. That's your current habit. And you've turned that into a habit. You know it's set up and you're going to do it. Now the next habit you want is to mind map it, to take notes. So you say, after I've read torts, I will spend 60 minutes creating a mind map of that subject in my office. Now we've taken a new habit and we've stacked it on top of the old one. So the first habit was to do the reading. The next habit is to do the mind map. Then we can stack another habit on it. After I've done the mind map, I will spend 60 minutes listening to the torts lecture and enhancing my mind map in my office at my desk. You see what happens. We start to create these longer stacks of assignments and work that we do. Now, if you look at our syllabus and study guide, you'll see that it's nothing other than stackable habits. What we've done is to take the habits and stack them on top of each other. You're going to do one thing, then the next thing, then the next thing. Then you go back and you do it again. The habit, it repeats itself over and over again. Now, why is this important? Well, imagine if I said to you, learn torts. Jackson, how am I supposed to learn torts? Yeah, it's a really tough question, isn't it? But if I say to you, what I want you to do is to read torts for 60 minutes, and then I want you to mind map it for 60 minutes, and then I want you to listen to a lecture for 60 minutes, and then I want you to do practice questions for 60 minutes. Each of those separate pieces, if you schedule them and set them up separately, becomes doable. They become manageable. It gets to this scope of work problem, and it becomes something that, instead of being overwhelming, becomes something that you can hold on to and say, you know what, I think I can implement that new behavior. And that's why our atomic habits become so powerful in my mind, because we break things down to these smaller pieces and work through those pieces. We even use atomic habits in our writing style. We actually teach people to write one paragraph at a time, one sentence at a time, so that they can simply stack those sentences on top of each other or those paragraphs on top of each other. It's diabolically simple and diabolically effective. So the idea here is that we start from the broadest level. When situation X arises, I'll perform response Y. We start with that, and then we go to, I will do a certain behavior at a certain time in a certain location, and then we stack, after the current habit, a new habit. And I'll have more to say about this in other episodes, but I wanted to just introduce the concept to you today, because I think if you're struggling with how to get started, this is probably the most effective thing you can do, is to write down these specific behaviors, the specific time and location, and then start stacking them as you create consistency. And as you create consistency, what you'll discover is that it really becomes a brand new habit. It's a stacked habit, and it works pretty easily. And if you're having trouble figuring out how that actually works in practice, just think about when you get up in the morning. You've got a whole series of habits. Certainly if you're like me, you've got a habit for brushing your teeth, you've got a habit for shaving, you got a habit for taking your shower and washing your hair, and I mean, doing all the things you got to do. You stack all those together, and it's your morning ritual. And so it's really nothing other than that, but we apply that to the bar exam. So we started with our reasons for procrastination, and then we talked about some habits that you can use to overcome delay. But you might be saying to yourself, boy, this sure seems difficult. It seems like a lot to do. Well, I want to suggest to you a few tools that I have found make it easier for people to employ these strategies. The first of the tools is something that we've been using for many years now. It's a tool called a paraliminal recording. Now, a paraliminal recording is simply a soundtrack that plays two different voice audio tracks in the left and the right ear. One side is going to your left brain, the other is going to your right brain, and it's two different narrations happening at the same time. The point of these narrations is to distract the conscious mind, to get it not confused, but just checked out, because you can't listen to two voices at the same time, as most of us know. And while that's happening, then we're talking to the non-conscious mind. Now, the soundtracks are audible. You can hear all of them. There's no subconscious processing going on here. There's no hidden subliminal tracks. But the interesting part is that what happens is that what's going from the right ear to the left brain is designed to get the left brain, the conscious brain, kind of engaged there. And then what's happening in your left ear going to your right brain is what's going to the non-conscious. So you can actually focus in on that and listen to it. And each of these soundtracks take about 20 to 30 minutes to listen to. It's passive. You just put on a pair of headphones or earbuds. You play them, and they have remarkable effects because they're really speaking directly to the non-conscious brain. Paraliminal recordings were created by Learning Strategies. They're the same people that do photo reading, and they have created over the years 50 to 60 different recordings on different topics. A few years ago, I sat down with the folks at Learning Strategies, and we went through the list of 50 or so recordings, and we curated a set of 16 of those recordings that we thought were most appropriate for bar exam students. And we offer those to our students, and we'll put a link in the show notes for you to check it out. Now, these topics of the recordings span a wide range, but there are 4 in particular that I find amazingly helpful when you're struggling with getting started. The first of the recordings is called Overcoming Overwhelm, and it's literally about feeling overwhelmed. You put this on, you listen to it for 20 minutes every day for 3 or 4 days, and what you'll begin to realize is that you're feeling less overwhelmed. You're feeling less just pushed back by the tide of events and how much work you have to do and how big the task is. It starts to break it down to size, and it's a fascinating recording, and one that's incredibly effective, particularly if you're feeling this overwhelm. There's just too much for me to do. Now, one other great thing about paraliminals is you can listen to them at night before you go to bed. You can listen to them in the morning when you get up. You can listen to them at just about any time, except when you're driving, because there is a segment of the paraliminal that for a lot of people, you'll just fall asleep for about 5 to 10 minutes of the recording. So you definitely don't want to do it while you're driving. The second recording that I suggest to our students that are struggling with how to get started is very simply called Get Around to It. Now, this one's been around for a long time, and it's used by people all the time who struggle with procrastinating in all kinds of areas of their lives. And I've used it myself a lot, and it's really remarkable. I listened to this recording a few times in a row over several days, and I find myself starting to do the thing I was procrastinating or putting off. It's not that I consciously say, well, now I'm going to do that thing I was procrastinating. I just find myself doing the thing. And then I say, why am I doing this thing I was putting off? It's just like whatever the block was isn't there, and I feel compelled to do it. It is really effective. If there's something that you hate doing, like your paperwork or your taxes or, mowing the yard or whatever it might be, listen to this recording, and you'll be surprised at how easy it is to get started. So if you're struggling with getting started with your bar studies, Get Around to It is probably the most effective of the recordings in the Paraliminal series. There are 2 other recordings that I like a lot when it comes to procrastination and delay and overwhelm. One is called Belief. This goes to that whole idea of fear that we talked about, the fear of failure, the fear of judgment. If you have a strong belief in yourself and a strong belief in what you're capable of doing, it really takes away a lot of those fear blocks, and those fear blocks can get in your way. And so I find it very effective to listen to this recording whenever I'm afraid of something, because my belief is really what's keeping me from being able to move forward. So if you find yourself truly afraid, Belief is one of the strongest recordings I think you can listen to. And it's great for lots of reasons, but certainly anytime you find fear to be a barrier in your life in any area, this is a great recording to listen to. And the last of the recordings that I like in this particular category is called Self-Esteem. I think when we talk about judgment and failure, it's easy to mix up the idea of failing the test with becoming a failure or being a failure. And that's certainly not true. And objectively, we could all look at it that way. But I think that in a non-subjective or non-objective way, subjectively, we would say, well, I feel like a failure. And I hear that from people all the time. If you feel like a failure, if you feel like you have let other people down, if you feel like you don't have the ability, that's really a self-esteem problem in some respects. And it can hit people who've been successful much harder than people that have had to struggle and fight their way along life's road. And so if you're feeling some of that, the Self-Esteem Paraliminal is a terrific tool. Again, you listen to it for 20 minutes a day for 3-4 days in a row, and then you come back and listen once a week or a couple times a month as you need it, just kind of like a booster shot. And it's a great way to break any habits that you've got. So if you've got bad habits, if you'd rather watch TV than study for the bar, instead of watching TV, listen to this Paraliminal and then see what happens. I think you'll find that you're then inclined to sit down and do your studies, particularly if you'd set up an I will do such and such a behavior at such and such a time in such and such a location. You'll be surprised how often that'll keep you away from watching Game of Thrones. All right, so paraliminal recordings, we've got a whole series of them, not just 4 of the 16, but I think they're really incredible and very effective, and I encourage you to check those out. They're audios that you can get from Learning Strategies. You download them to your mobile device, put them in your library, and listen to them anytime that you want. So really encourage you to check that out. And then the final tool that I want to talk about here today, and again, there are plenty of tools available, but in addition to paraliminals, I think meditation is really, really important. You know, the whole goal of meditation is to become aware, it's to become mindful, it's to become conscious of the choices that we're making. So many of us make choices in our lives that we're not really conscious of that are very harmful to us. And delaying your studies for the bar would be harmful. And consciously, no one would choose to do that. But non-consciously, we find all kinds of reasons and excuses to not study. And then it becomes harmful to us. Well, one of the goals and one of the benefits of meditation is that you become clear on what those decisions are, what's really going on. If you had trouble doing the first exercise I talked about, the making a list of things that you're afraid of, meditation will help you get to the point where you can make that list. Now, there are lots of different ways to meditate. A lot of people like to use meditative yoga, or they literally go in and meditate and, you know, cross-legged on the floor. That's a lot of work. And for me, I try to take the simpler way to do this. So I have 2 tools that I use. One that's fairly recent that I'm really excited about. And if you're watching on video, I am now holding up a box for a product called Muse, M-U-S-E. Now, Muse is a brain sensor headband. And again, if you're watching on video, this is the best part because I'm going to put on this headband. But essentially, it just goes right over your ears and to your forehead, and it senses your brain waves and how your brain activity is going. Once you've got this baseline set using the headset, you then just use your basic app on your phone, your iPhone or your Android phone. And it starts to measure using a soundtrack, a series of different soundtracks, and you can set the time for as long or short as you want. And here's what happens. When you're agitated and your mind is restless and anxious, you're going to hear thunderstorms and lightning and big waves rolling in and bad weather. As you start to calm down, the weather calms down, and when you're really calm, you'll hear birds chirping in the background. Now, I know this sounds really silly, but it counts the number of birds you hear, and it tells you how long you're in the calm state, how long you're in the neutral state, and how long you're in an active state. And I got to tell you, I've become obsessed with how many birds I get. The more birds I get, obviously, the better. And I really want to hear those birds. But it's a great way to give you immediate feedback on how you are responding as you meditate. You're really just focusing on your breath. And these are guided meditations, but you can also turn off the guide and just listen to the soundtrack and listen to the weather as it comes in. It is a fabulous, fabulous product. We are excited. We're an affiliate for these folks because I like the product so much. You can see that it gives you sounds of a beach or a rainforest, and it's just, it's awesome. So we're going to link to it here. We've got a special price on this savings for you. You just buy the headset, the app is free, and they update it periodically, and I really like it. It's called Muse. You can find it at muse.com, but literally even 3 minutes a day just to get started. And I have a lot of students that have started at 3 minutes, and then they go up to 5 and 10, and on from there to 20 or 25, 30 minutes a day. I think it's really, really valuable, and you can do that at any point of the day or night, and so I would suggest that. Now, if you want something even easier than that, and there is something easier, there is a product called Holosync produced by Centerpoint Research Institute. And we've offered Holosync to our students for over a decade now. I love Holosync. It is a series of recordings. You literally just play it on your device, on your phone or your pad or your laptop, and put it in your headphones. And it uses binaural beats. Again, the same idea as the paraliminals, 2 different soundtracks or different sound waves going in the left and right ear. Now, what's happening here is that in this soundtrack, which is just a nice Chinese water chime and the sound of water flowing, they're produced at different brainwave frequencies. The brain tries to equalize these 2 frequencies between the left and the right brain, and in doing so, it creates the effect of a calm meditative state. And you don't have to do anything. You can be asleep when it's happening. It meditates you. You don't have to meditate it. So if you find it difficult to focus on your breath and meditation, then Holosync is a great, great tool to use, because you just put it on, listen to it for half hour or an hour a day, and it will meditate you and give you the same benefits of meditation. And the reason that we want you to meditate is because we want you to get clarity on what you're doing and why you're doing it. If you're having trouble getting started, there is a reason. Maybe it's something I've talked about today. Maybe it's something completely different. But I have found that when people meditate, they get a lot of clarity and a lot of insight as to what it is that's really holding them back. And then they can start to deal with it. Often they use meditation to find what the problem is, and then they use a paraliminal to start to address that problem. I'm afraid of failure, or I'm overwhelmed with what's going on, or I just don't believe in myself, whatever it might be. Or I've got anxiety about the process, and there's a paraliminal for that. So these tools working together can be extremely effective and helpful for you. And again, we'll link to all of the tools that I've talked about today, but I certainly recommend the paraliminals, the Muse meditation system, and Holosync. They're all really, really powerful ways to help you get at what's causing you to delay. Well, really, when we look at this idea of why it's so hard to get started, I think that it's critical to recognize that if you're feeling that, you're not alone. It's a very common problem, but it's one that can be solved. It's one that can be managed, and it really comes from having this understanding of what's stopping you and then working to resolve it. The techniques of habit stacking can go a long way to doing it, and the tools of paraliminals and meditation can make that process even easier. So I encourage you to try all those things out. And let me know your results, and let me know what's happening as you get underway. Well, that's our message for today. Been great to have you with us here on the podcast. Again, we're so thrilled that you're here. If this was your first time on the podcast, thanks for joining us. Look forward to your honest rating and reviews. Like I said, I don't love judgment, but I want your honest rating and reviews on iTunes, and we'd love to have you do that. Don't forget that we've got our free webinar coming up Thursday night at 7 p.m. local time. You can register by going to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar or by clicking the button here on the show notes page. We'll be back again next Wednesday with more information about the bar. We should have results in from Florida. We'll let you know what's happening there. And we wish good luck to everyone, regardless of your jurisdiction, who might be waiting for their results. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again next week.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.